Hi, my name is Michael McDonald, and today we will be going over the legislative history of the Wilderness Act of 1964. The Wilderness Act of 1964 began with the vision of established wilderness preservation. The purpose of the Wilderness Act, as stated by Public Law 88-577, is to assure that an increasing population, accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization, does not occupy and modify all areas within the United States and its possessions, leaving no land designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition. Another purpose of the Wilderness Act was to establish a definition of wilderness. This definition states that a wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor and does not remain. Further definitions include areas that imprints of man are unnoticed, opportunities for solitude are accessible, has a sufficient area for practical preservation, and hosts ecological, geological, and other features that offer scientific, educational, scenic, or historical value. Before the signing of the Wilderness Act, the establishment of a vision of wilderness first evolved. Some key characters in the establishment of this idea were John Muir, Aldo Leopold, Bob Marshall, and Howard Saniser. These individuals and others held the same view that wilderness had value beyond the obvious use for recreation. One of the earliest propositions of wilderness was by Aldo Leopold and the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico. Leopold saw wilderness as a fundamental instrument for building citizens and was responsible for the first U.S. Forest Service initiative recognizing the value of wilderness areas as wilderness. Burgeoning off Leopold's advocacy, an inventory of areas of undeveloped national forests was prompted. In 1929, the Forest Service introduced the L-20 regulation, which was the first national policy for preservation of wilderness. The purpose of L-20 was to maintain primitive conditions of transportation, subsistence, habitation, and environment to the fullest degree compatible with their highest public use, with a view to conserving the values of such areas for purposes of public education and recreation. In 1935, Bob Marshall became the driving force for the establishment of the Wilderness Society. The Society, in conjunction with the Sierra Club, began to cultivate wilderness action and thought that would gain traction in the following decades. Members of the Wilderness Society, Sierra Club, National Parks Association, and more began to see the influence of commercial entities on federal agencies. The fear of the loss of preservation of these wilderness areas in perpetuity came to the forefront when the National Park Service became more involved in recreation expansion and proposing even more tourism facilities. The 1940s and 1950s saw reclassification of primitive areas. Though total acreage of wilderness areas was not decreased, the overall quality did not remain the same. Forests were essentially traded for rocky outcrops and ice peaks. This led to a push from Saniser to begin an intensive study of the nation's wilderness to be carried out by the Library of Congress. During that time, the victory of Echo Park, which ensured the protection of the Green River in Dinosaur National Park from a dam construction, allowed the conservationists within Washington, D.C. to gain new confidence in their advocacy for congressional action. This victory prompted Saniser to draft the Wilderness Bill in 1956. By June of that year, the bill was introduced to the Senate by Senator Humphrey and to the House by Representative John Saylor. The bill underwent a substantial reviewing process. In September 1961, the Senate passed the bill 78-8. This victory was led by Senators Clinton P. Anderson and Frank Church. Unfortunately, this bill had been amended to such a degree that it prompted dissatisfaction from conservationists who in turn killed the bill before it could be brought to the House floor in 1962. In November 1963, a compromise was confirmed by President Kennedy. The revision of this bill concluded that in order to add a new area of wilderness, it would have to be by affirmative congressional approval, or a new act of Congress. The bill passed the House in July 1964 and was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson on September 3rd of that year. This prompted the creation of the National Wilderness Preservation System, which is composed of federally owned areas that are sanctioned as wilderness areas by Congress for the present and future American people. The passage of the Act in 1964 established many outcomes for the future of wilderness. There is now an established national policy in order to preserve wilderness and recognizing it as a valuable resource, a definition of wilderness that is specified within the Act itself. The Act also established the National Wilderness Preservation System. In regards to federal land management, there is now a set Wilderness Management Directive, a review process in which there is a 10-year time allotment for recommendations of wilderness to be reviewed by Congress, and finally, an exclusive power of Congress to designate wilderness. Here is a collection of the references in which I used for this legislative history of the Wilderness Act of 1964.